If you have joined me live, thank you very much for joining. Just to introduce myself, first of all, for those of you who may not know me very well, so my name is Nabila. I am a pharmacist, an independent prescriber. I have worked for the last kind of 6 years or so in primary care in a tech company, and have led a team of 100 plus independent prescribers. So that means I've had to think about a lot of things related to independent prescribing, mitigate risks, make sure that I'm protected, also the team is protected and the organisation is protected. So that's why I'm here talking to you guys today about how to protect yourself as a prescriber. So looking forward to going through some of the areas that I want to talk about today. Most of these have been pulled out from some of the questions that I've received. So thank you very much to all of you who have sent me DMs about questions relating to the topic. I've kind of amalgamated them all into a couple of different things so that I can cover all of those questions for you in the next half hour. If you are joining live and you have any questions, please feel free to add them into the chat box, and hopefully I should receive them or read them out and then also answer the questions for you as well. So I hope your day is going well. I hope that you find this session useful. I would love for you to kind of reach out to me, either if you're watching live or if you're watching the recorded version, and let me know what you think. So please feel free to kind of reach out and tell me what you think worked well. But actually equally, please feel free to reach out and let me know when you think there's something that's either missing or that I could do differently. Would love to hear from you. Thank you, Marvin. Marvin's just written in the box, came here to say you are amazing, Nabila. You are equally amazing. So thank you for joining. And thank you for joining Altaf. Okay, brilliant. So I first of all just wanted to kind of contextualize first of all. So I think it's really important to kind of think about the context within where pharmacist prescribers sit within healthcare. I think that might help us to kind of further understand the way that other healthcare professionals react, the way that things like the regulators react to pharmacist prescribers. So I think it's really important just to take a few minutes just to think about like where we sit within that realm. Excuse me. So pharmacist prescribers are very new to healthcare. I think the first pharmacist prescriber kind of qualified about 20 years ago, but actually they haven't really infiltrated general healthcare until very, very recently. And I think the fact that we've had the COVID pandemic and also shortage of other healthcare professionals means that it's kind of really accelerated the growth of pharmacist prescribers within this domain, and also the fact that the legislation is changing in a couple of years' time, and all of the pharmacists will be prescribers, means that there's there's much more of us now. So much more of us are enrolling onto the course and becoming prescribers and actually actively using our qualification, because we realise that actually from 2027 onwards, that actually all of the undergraduates or the newly qualified pharmacists will be using their qualifications as well. So I think it's really important to kind of like just think about that when we think about anyone that kind of is in the prescribing domain, and I think there's a lot more work to be done. And I think by understanding how to protect yourself and how to actually convey how qualified you are actually is a really good kind of first step when you're prescribing in any domain. So, and also just to clarify, so I have worked primarily in primary care as a prescriber, but actually this is applicable to any sector really. So whether you're working in a community, in clinic, in secondary care, in primary care, or actually any other sector, I think you could equally transfer any of this information to any of those sectors. So hopefully you should all be able to kind of relate to the information that I provide you. Thank you for joining, Bindu. And yes, I completely agree. This is probably quite useful, particularly for those who are recently qualified or recently starting to use their prescribing qualification. So there's quite a few pharmacists who maybe have had their qualification for a number of years, but actually haven't really used it very much and are starting to use it now more because of the changing kind of environment in healthcare. So like I said, that's really important to just kind of understand the kind of healthcare environment, how it's changing, and how pharmacists are fitting in as prescribers is super, super important. Now, I think one of the first things that I think about when I think about pharmacist prescribers is really CPD. And I'm going to say something potentially controversial here. But I personally think the mandatory CPD that we have from the GPHC is definitely not sufficient to demonstrate that you're practicing safely as a prescriber. So I think yeah, absolutely, that's a mandatory requirement for us to remain registered as pharmacists, and that's something that we have to do. But actually, that would not be enough for me. So if I had a prescriber come to me and ask me for a job in prescribing, and they said this is all the CPD that they did, that would definitely not be enough. So I think it's worth kind of taking a step back and thinking about, so what are you doing to kind of upskill yourself? What are you doing to maintain your skills within the scope of prescribing that you have? Are you expanding your scope currently? And what is it that you're doing? How are you doing that? I always ask anyone that I work with to take a step back and think about CPD from the perspective of someone who they're trying to demonstrate their knowledge and skills to. So if they weren't able to kind of look through your portfolio, whatever it is, and understand exactly what it is that you're qualified in, then you probably haven't got enough information written down. So it sounds like additional work, but actually it's really just consolidating the information and the knowledge and skills that you already have. And it's really, really important. And going back to the point about kind of prescribers, pharmacist prescribers being quite new to the healthcare domain, there is some uncertainty around pharmacist prescribers. And I think that by having the right CPD in place, having the right knowledge and skills, and being able to demonstrate that to anyone who actually asks us questions, particularly other healthcare professionals, I think will give other healthcare professionals an air of confidence in the skills that we have to prescribe. I think I just want to add almost like a footnote here in that. I think that my personal view is that actually pharmacists are probably the best healthcare professionals to prescribe. I mean, we spend so much time in our undergraduate degree learning about medicines, right? So for me, it's a no-brainer. It's, we must be the best healthcare professionals to be able to prescribe. I think when we look at our kind of medical colleagues, for example, the assumption is that actually they're the best prescribers, but actually the amount of time that they spend studying medicines in their undergraduate degree and actually throughout their practice is very small. And actually their knowledge and skills is geared around diagnosing, and ours is around medicines. And so prescribing is a really natural extension for me. And I think that we have the potential to be the best prescribers if we lay the right foundations down prior to kind of embarking on a kind of prescribing practice. I've got a really long comment here. I'm just going to have a quick look. Okay, and I will come back to that in a minute. So that was just kind of a footnote to add into that. So I just wanted to kind of help you to understand my perspective when I'm talking about kind of prescribing for pharmacists and the kind of how you protect yourself in this kind of environment. I think the other thing to add, actually, I don't think I mentioned earlier, is that I previously worked as an inspector, so for the GPHC, and I did that around the time that the kind of prescribing qualification was kind of emerging in community practice. So I got kind of a really great flavour of how pharmacists were using it and how the regulator would look at kind of managing risks and the way that they would approach protecting patients in that kind of domain. So I'd also be looking at it through that lens as well. So just useful to know. So going back to kind of the point about CPD. So like I said, I don't think the mandatory CPD is enough. There's loads of kind of frameworks and things out there. I think the RPS has a framework for prescribers, and there's probably other organisations as well out there who have frameworks for competencies and things for prescribers. So if you haven't already, I would work your way through those. Super important, helping to really kind of consolidate your knowledge and skills. But that will really just help hone in on the knowledge and skills that you have as a prescriber versus that for your particular scope. So there's also some additional work to be done around your actual scope. So for example, if your scope is, I don't know, mental health, and you're treating patients with depression and anxiety, for example, it would be useful for you to kind of go away and document something to demonstrate that you have enough knowledge and skills to be able to understand the different conditions, understand how to treat those conditions. So, have you looked at the NICE guidelines? Is there anything else that you need to look at? Quite often, for example, in depression and anxiety, we have to chop and change medicines until we find one that the patient is comfortable with. They don't have side effects. They're able to kind of remember to take every day, etc. So, how do you titrate from one medicine to another? So have you done some kind of CPD, or how have you consolidated your information on that? So they're just kind of examples off the top of my head on one specific topic. So I would expect someone to have some of that information documented if they're working in that kind of environment. But just to stress, that the mandatory CPD from the GPHC is just not enough. So you have to go and do some extra work before you're able to kind of demonstrate actually objectively that you have the right skills to be able to make independent clinical decisions. That's your prescribing piece, and look at evidence and things like that. But then also be able to demonstrate that you have enough clinical information to be able to work in the scope that you're working in. So almost like two sets of information that you have to have. Okay, brilliant. And as I mentioned, I think it's really, really useful just to actually try and do everything so that you're almost looking at it from the lens of, if I had to demonstrate this to someone externally, what would I need to do? So that means making sure everything is documented, particularly from the perspective of CPD. So I don't think, me personally, I think that, there's lots of room for me to improve the documentation that I have, for example. And I'm sure there's others of you out there that maybe don't write everything that you learn down. So, coming up with some kind of a structure or framework to be able to make sure that you capture everything there. But also just in terms of your day-to-day practice. So when you're actually consulting with patients, whether you do that in a face-to-face environment, in a digital, whether it's the questionnaire type in an online pharmacy, have you documented everything? If your clinical decision is slightly outside of the normal scope or normal guidelines, have you documented why? So, this patient is XYZ and this is why I've taken this decision instead of this decision. Everything needs to be documented, really, so you're able to kind of work your way back, so that if someone external did go and look at that, then actually they can see that they can see really clearly this was your clinical rationale within this environment. I think that's incredibly important. And making sure things like your records are up to date. So, always, it sounds really straightforward, but actually just making sure that you document your patient notes, either whilst you're talking to the patient or as soon as after you're talking to the patient. If you've ever done a clinic of any kind, you'll know that patients kind of merge one into another. So it's really important to make sure that you've got accurate information recorded for every single patient. Okay. What else do I want to talk about today? So reflection. I think I wanted to talk a bit about reflection today. And this almost comes back to the point about CPD, actually. So it's really, really important as a prescriber, particularly, to reflect on your practice. I think that as pharmacists, our skills on reflection vary considerably. I can't tell you the amount of times I've visited pharmacies, for example, and seen on their near miss log, things like check more carefully next time you make a mistake, next time you dispense or check or whatever it is. That isn't a reflection. That's just almost like fobbing off something that's not actually critically reflecting and reflecting in your practice. So in that particular scenario, I would actually just think about like the actual time and the date and things like that. So was it that I was distracted by, I don't know, the phones or a delivery driver, or was it that I was trying to multitask, or did I have something else on my mind? Was I just having a bad day? I had an argument with someone at home, or something about my children was bothering me, and that's why I was not 100% at work, and that's why I made that mistake. That is a reflection, not to check more carefully next time. That's just a really basic example of reflecting, but it's really, really important to be critical when you reflect. And you don't have to show anyone, so you don't have to kind of air your reflections to the rest of the world or to other colleagues. The reflection is really there just to benefit you. So just to make sure that you're able to reflect on your practice and improve, and kind of make more complex decisions next time. So that's really, really important. One thing that does actually really help aid reflection, that actually I don't see very many pharmacists or pharmacist prescribers do, is clinical supervision. Not many pharmacists actually know what clinical supervision is, so I'll just kind of go through that very top line. So clinical supervision is where you have a clinical supervisor, and most people assume it's a GP, and it really doesn't need to be. Clinical supervision is where you reflect on a situation in your practice that you found difficult, and you then talk through that situation with either one colleague who's a clinical supervisor, or a group of colleagues if you're doing group clinical supervision. And in the one-to-one or in the group, we all basically help you to reflect on whatever that difficult situation was. That really helps you to kind of almost see your, I describe it as like your blind spot. So, when you're driving and, you always have this blind spot that you can't see, and, you go and get mirrors and things like that to help you see. So basically, I would describe clinical supervision as, getting those mirrors and being able to kind of see around the corner almost, and see things that you maybe wouldn't see in your kind of normal practice. And that really just helps you to kind of expand your scope. And actually doing it in a group is really, really useful, because actually you're able to hear how other people may have dealt with the situation that you were in, and actually also just think about other perspectives as well. So I think that's super useful to do. Like I said, most people assume that a clinical supervisor is a GP, but actually it doesn't need to be at all. I was, for example, a clinical supervisor at Babylon, and really just led sessions to help as a group, colleagues, to understand a bit more about why they found a particular situation difficult. It's always very personal. So we obviously ask you to go away and think about a situation where actually something was a bit more difficult, and you found it difficult to make a decision for X, Y, or Z reason. And then just by asking some really kind of open-ended questions, understanding a bit more about why that individual thought that situation was difficult, then it can actually really help them to kind of expand their scope and stuff. So if you don't already do something like that, then I would suggest kind of speaking to members of your organisation to see if that's something that you can get set up. But that's a really good way to help protect, and actually that works both ways. So that's something that helps individual prescribers help improve their practice, but also helps an organisation demonstrate that actually they're being really diligent and really helping to support their colleagues, but also helping to support patient safety as well. Moving on, let's just have a quick look at the comments or questions. I think Bindu's written on there, and support systems, so that must have been related to something I spoke about. So yes, definitely a support system is really important. So making sure that you've got someone that you can kind of reach out to if you've got a difficult scenario or decision or something like that. So that's really, really important. So and important in helping you protect yourself as well. So understanding where your limitations are and when to reach out to someone and who to reach out to actually is really, really important. I've got a really long comment here, but I'm not able to read that right now, so apologies. I'm not able to explain tuberculosis today. That's out of the scope of our session today. Hey Komal, so just realised that we perform clinical supervision and our accountability group calls with our independent prescribing pharmacists. Yes, quite likely you do. I think that the term clinical supervision is really misleading. So it sounds as though you're kind of like almost being overseen by someone, and it sounds almost like it's quite authoritative, but actually clinical supervision is very empowering, and really helps you to become a lot more autonomous. So I think the term is very misleading. I'm not sure why it's called clinical supervision. I think it's very common. It may have come from actually our therapist colleagues actually use it quite a lot. Really well. So if you ever speak to a therapist or someone in that kind of area, mental health area, they use clinical supervision quite a lot, and use it very, very well, use it very regularly, and help to learn from each other in that kind of space. But yeah, it's just to help you to become more autonomous, help you to see another perspective, and help you to reflect ultimately on your practice, which I think is super important. I've got another question here. So as a remote prescriber, how to stay safe, how to manage a situation where you're not competent. So it really depends, Amir. So I think there's things that you can do to make sure that you have in place to ensure that if you're prescribing remotely, that actually there's certain kind of foundations laid. I'm sure I did a live session on online prescribing a couple of months ago, so please feel free to kind of look back through my LinkedIn page and see what I kind of commented on there about a situation when you don't feel competent. I think the best way to learn in a situation where you don't feel competent is to gather as much information as possible. So I think it's really easy to actually have this like knee-jerk reaction when you come across something that you're not familiar with or is totally out of your scope. But actually the principles of like consulting with a patient are very similar in most conditions, but what I would personally do is I would gather it depends on the way that I was consulting, but I would gather a history, so gather some basic kind of information about the patient, basic information about what it is that the patient is consulting for. If I realised that actually there was a red flag or there was something that was kind of totally outside of my scope or outside of my competency, I would simply just explain to the patient. If it's kind of a questionnaire type consultation, then I would pick up the phone and call the patient and say, look, really sorry, but this is not the kind of stuff that I'm trained to deal with. This is the reason why. I'd really like you to go and see XYZ, like your GP or someone else who is better able to kind of help you in this particular situation. and then document everything you do. So make sure that you document you've contacted the patient, you've spoken to them, the nature of your conversation, how they responded as well. So that you've then protected yourself. So you've got an audit trail there of exactly what's happened, the reason that you've referred this patient, and who you've referred this patient to. That's super, super important. If you haven't documented it, and the patient came back and said, oh, well, so-and-so didn't treat me, then actually you haven't really done yourself a very good service kind of protecting yourself, because you haven't documented that situation. So that's the kind of the way that I would approach it. I think it's really important. So I think patients can tell when you genuinely want to help them, or when you're kind of really just thinking, oh my god, this is completely outside of my scope and I can't do this. So I think it's really important just to approach every single patient with an open mind, and just make sure that you don't transfer that anxiety over to the patient. So just kind of taking a step back and trying to understand how the patient might be feeling in that particular situation. And then also just really really just explaining in as plain language as possible. So I've seen many pharmacists kind of really go into, oh, it's not in my scope, and using technical terms which actually the patient won't really understand. So just in as layman terms as possible, just explain to the patient that actually this is the reason why I'm not able to. So I've been trained to do X, Y, and Z. So I'm not trained to deal with this particular scenario. I'm really sorry, but this is who you can go to instead. So we all want the patient to be as safe as possible, and just explain that to them. And sometimes it can be a difficult conversation, particularly if the patient is wanting something specific at that particular point in time, and it might cause a delay in their treatment. But actually, I think the emphasis is to really play on the fact that you want to make sure that that patient is safe. So that's really important to kind of emphasize to the patient. But thank you for your question. Let's see if we've got any others. Otherwise, I'll see if I've got any in my DMs. Bear with me 1 second and I'll have a quick look. I think that is it for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining the live. Again, if you haven't had the chance to join me live today, that's not a problem. Please feel free to kind of review this session at any time. So it should be recorded on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Please feel free to drop me a message if for any reason you can't access, and I'll see if I can help you through. And like I said, I'd love to hear from you if you have any feedback. So if there's anything that you found particularly useful about me rambling on today, or actually if there's anything that you would like me to add next time I do a live session. I quite often do polls about the types of sessions that I will be doing in my live sessions. So please feel free to drop me a line and let me know what you'd like me to talk about next. Make sure that you keep in contact. And I think this will be my last live before Christmas and obviously this year. So I hope everyone has a great Christmas and a very early happy New Year. I'm sure I'll be in contact virtually anyway. However, this will be my last live, hopefully for this year. And yeah, I'll speak to you guys in this format, hopefully at some point next year now. But thank you, everyone.